everything that we offer, please go to our website, politics-prose.com. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask y'all to please silence your cell phones so not to disrupt the event. When we get to the time for questions, we've placed a standing microphone at the end of the aisle to your right. Following the Q&A, we'll have a signing line up here at the table, so if you haven't purchased a book yet, we have lots of copies available behind our registers at the front of the store. We ask that you please line up starting at the pillar, and staff will come by for personalization. Once the event is complete, we ask that you please fold up your chairs and lean them against something sturdy to help us out. I'm very excited to welcome Tara Isabella Burton. Tara Isabella Burton has written on religion and secularism for National Geographic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and more, and holds a doctorate in theology from Oxford. She's also the author of 3 novels, Social Creature, World Cannot Give, and Here in Avalon, which is forthcoming in 2024, as well as one prior work of nonfiction called Strange Rites. She lives in New York. Tara will be in conversation with Damir Murasic. Damir is an assignment editor at the Washington Post Opinions. He's also a co-founder with Shadi Hamid of Wisdom of Crowds, which is an ideas publication and podcast. Now, please join me in welcoming Tara Isabella Burton and Damir Murasic.
Does this work? Yeah, it does.
Does mine? Yes, mine works.
All right. Welcome everyone. Tara, let's just start. Just wanted to say a few words. We've known each other for quite some time now, it feels like.
Like 10 years?
Yeah, not quite. Coming up on it. I think I looked back. You published your first essay for me when I was working at the American Interest magazine in 2016. And it was about D'Annunzio, who features in the book that we're here to discuss, SelfMade. You were at the time, I think, Vox's religion reporter. And you've always been a terrific and insightful essayist. I really encourage all of you to check out Tara's work. I mean, obviously her books, but also her essays. And then since that time, you've written 2 novels and 2 nonfiction books, which is, I think, really quite an achievement, and they all, I think, in one way or another, grapple with identity and meaning in the modern world, if that's fair to say. I also sort of dare say you've self-made yourself into quite a public intellectual, and just I don't know, just congratulations on that. It's been really wonderful to watch. So anyway, the book we're here to talk about, SelfMade, is a book about human tendency to self-actualization, which you, I think, correctly trace back to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, to sort of the moment where reason and, the idea that reason is freeing us from superstitions, and whether those superstitions are, organized religion and faith, or tradition. So, I mean, first an easy question. Why this book right now? What's the origin story? What prompted you to start thinking about those issues at this moment in time?
So, my doctoral research from 2017, which I'm convinced apparently is a decade ago, was on 19th century dandyism and theology. So a little bit of Oscar Wilde, but mostly some of the French figures who appear in the book, Joris Karl Huysmans, Barbey d'Orvilliers, and like many people who do a doctoral thesis on something a little bit obscure, I was convinced that actually understanding these obscure figures was the key to understanding all of the modern world. But with time, I kind of put that project away when I finished my doctorate, and I was working for Vox.com, as you mentioned, and working very much on the contemporary world. My first nonfiction book, Strange Rites, was about the spiritual but not religious in the present day. But increasingly, the questions that I was interested in, the question of what does it mean to create oneself as a work of art, and more broadly, what does it mean to create oneself, became more and more relevant the more that social media, influencer culture, personal branding became part of everyday life. And so around 2020, during the pandemic, I went back to the idea of self-making and thought, this is a story that I want to tell, not just because I find these 19th century figures interesting, but because I think that you can't understand anything going on today, whether it's influencer culture, whether it's OnlyFans, whether it's Caroline Calloway, whether it's the idea of manifesting and this kind of quasi-religious, quasi-spiritual faith in the fact that our authentic inward selves can get in touch with the secret energies of the universe. All of this is part of a much bigger story. And so SelfMade became a way to grapple with that story.
Well, so the subtitle says From Da Vinci to Kardashian. So this is not a new phenomenon. But at the same time, it's not been the same phenomenon throughout history. It's been changing. Maybe say a few words about what has changed between Da Vinci and Kim Kardashian.
Sure, absolutely. So the book does start with the Renaissance. I will confess that while Da Vinci is the more selling, publisher-friendly subtitle, most of that chapter is about Albrecht Dürer, who I think is even weirder and more wonderful. But ultimately, this story is about people whose lives don't necessarily fit in with the circumstance into which they are born, which is this concern of the Renaissance genius. It is the concern of the dandy. It's concern of these people who don't quite fit in the social order. And what does that mean about the social order? And what is extremely interesting in some of these earlier ways of grappling with the cultural figure of the self-maker, for example, the Renaissance genius, is that there's still an attempt to kind of reify the social order through its exceptions. So the geniuses are coded as basically bastard children of God. A lot of the rhetoric around them about true nobility versus the sort of nobility of the aristocracy is rooted in this imagery that some people, super special, different people, are uniquely blessed by God or nature or fortune with particular abilities. So the idea that the self-maker is a kind of a demigod, and that idea does stay throughout history, but it does change, particularly in America, where the narrative is much more democratic, I call it, this narrative that it is a self-maker is simply anyone can be a self-maker. And indeed, everyone should be a self-maker. But it is through hard work and effort and the kind of American dream bootstrap story. And then we see throughout, like the 19th century particularly, let's say 18th and 19th centuries, two kind of distinct, I argue, parallel narratives, this American and this European ideal, the aristocratic and the democratic. And then in the 20th century, they converge and stuff gets weird. And what I mean by that, and I argue, I trace this to Hollywood and it, and this kind of celebrity culture that blends the hard work element and the innate element. But essentially what we get, particularly in the Warhol era onward, is a kind of double story where the self-maker is both a sort of god who is specially chosen, but also works for it and displays the truth of that specialness through hard work. But also that the work is increasingly linked to something that is innate. I think of there's a 1928, I believe, a self-help ad for a course called Personal Magnetism. And the tagline for the course is, everyone has it, but 1 in a million knows how to use it. And I think that idea that there is something that is sort of unique to us, quote unquote, authentic to us, that is our usness, that is sort of a raw material, that is sort of divine or divinized in one sense, but that through self-cultivation, perhaps even a little bit of artificiality, we are expressing our true selves to the world by making ourselves into who we want to be. And so the idea of innateness and the idea of hard work get fused in this vision of self-expression as a kind of work that proves the truth of the innateness.
And so, that juxtaposition between the aristocratic and the democratic and it coming together in the 20th century, there's a feeling, though, also in the book that it's quickening, right? Like it's getting faster and faster. So when we are today, it's not just that they're converging, but that they've almost converged somehow. What are the consequences of that, like in the current moment?
Nothing good.
Yeah.
Or rather, to answer your question more seriously, I think it's tempting to think about self-making, or rather, it is possible to think about self-making as this exciting liberatory story of kind of being liberated from the shackles of the circumstances of birth towards a kind of freedom. And I argue that is an incomplete story in many ways. But I do think that one way of looking at the present situation, perhaps the most optimistic view, which I do not share, isn't this great? It used to be that only the dandies and these sort of demigods could create themselves as works of art. But now everybody can do it. But I think in practice what has happened is because we live in an attention economy where personal branding is more and more necessary for more and more of us, the kind of best case version of artistic self-making, the idea that we are affirming some uniqueness or some individuality or some irreducibility against the background of mass production, mechanical reproduction, mass technology, which is the kind of story of a lot of these 19th century dandies dealing with industrialization and urbanization. What's actually happening is that because self-making is just something that all of us are expected to do professionally, the sense of originality or the kind of moral quest for irreducibility, I think, has been lost. And I think what we have now is a situation where, self-making is just something we check off our to-do list. We wake up, we check our emails, we, clear our inbox, we engage in a degree of self-creation as part of like something that we kind of have to do rather than something that either we want to do. And I think that means that we are all kind of increasingly alienated from, not just from ourselves, but more importantly from one another.
Yeah, I did want to get to that. Let's return to that sort of a little bit later about sort of the path forward. I guess the thing that struck me about the book and even the earlier passages before we get to the modern, you said your dissertation was about the dandies and the passage. I forget what chapter, third or fourth chapter, talking about Regency England. Mm-hmm. Clearly, you were deep into that. One word that doesn't come up in your book is decadence. And some of the chapters there really, it just sort of kept coming up in my mind as a sense of this kind of culture of self-making and self-actualization, even in the sort of Enlightenment mold and post-Enlightenment mold, not quite yet modern, but there's a real frivolity to it. I feel like you wrote the book in a very even-keeled way to not pass judgment until the last chapter, which, again, I think we get to. Why not the word decadence? Does it apply, or is that the wrong category?
So I'm wary of the word decadence as someone who worked on 19th century French decadence, precisely because I think that it's one of those words that in kind of contemporary parlance means something like quite exciting, or can easily be translated into I'm talking about a lot of sex and drugs and parties and rock and roll. And I don't actually think that's what the 19th century French decadents were doing either. But I do think it's a word that has a connotation that isn't necessarily the connotation that I want. I think that the decadence that I would want to talk about in this book is this sense, is actually the quintessential 19th century French decadent version of it, which is the sense that history is exhausted and that there's a kind of nihilism that comes from envisioning a world where nothing means anything, or where nothing means anything except for what we choose. And this is very much, I think, a story about theology, a story about religion. I'm not just saying that as an ex-theologian. Although I once met a priest who told me there's no such thing as an ex-theologian, so maybe I'm a current theologian. But I think that this SelfMade is a story of a certain kind of disenchantment of the vision of the world, and particularly of our social world. The idea that how we relate to each other, how we exist with one another as well as within ourselves, is not divinely ordained or chosen, but merely accidental. And one of the questions that then comes up for a lot of these figures, especially in the 19th century onwards, is what then? And I think we see visions in America, a more obvious re-enchantment, where you just proto-vibes thinking, basically, where the world is re-enchanted through positive thinking and looking inwardly and getting in touch with the secret energy undercurrent of it all. And the European, more Nietzschean model tends to be a little bit more explicit about the fact that nothing means anything. But what both movements, the American and the European, come down to, I think, is this sense that nothing is meaningful except what we choose to be meaningful or hold as meaningful. Or to put it another way, the closest thing to divinity in our world is human choice, and I believe specifically human desire. What we want is the engine on which the vibes of the universe, as it were, run. And I think that within that framework, where decadence comes in, is this idea that basically nothing means anything but our own desires. And so on the one hand, we can fulfill our desires however we want, because that is the power that we have. We might as well. But there's a sort of sadness to the act of sating our desires, precisely because we're, and perhaps I'm being too editorial here, but hungering for something that doesn't exist, or the price of being able to fulfill our desires is a sense of loneliness, that maybe we are all that there is. And that is absolutely present in the 19th century French decadents that I study and love, many of whom were also dandies or theorists of dandyism. But more broadly, I think that's the kind of the decadent condition, where the parties and the drugs and the sex or any kind of manifestations of desire are more sad than they are fun.
But there's a, and you've actually, I think in the New Atlantis recent piece that you wrote, sort of travels to Silicon Valley and sort of the scene there. The chapter on Silicon Valley, though, it's not that it doesn't fit, because it is about a certain kind of self-perfectibility, but it is more, I don't know, I hesitate to say this, optimistic about the future. More, they have an idea about the future. It's not that everything's ended, right? There's a real idea about how you build the future. I mean, perhaps misguided, but it's different. I mean, say a little bit about sort of Silicon Valley today and how that fits in.
So I think the point where it fits in is that it is a much more robust and joyful acceptance of the idea that in a disenchanted world, we are the only gods. Of course, that's what sort of Stuart Brand's motto in the whole Earth catalog is: we are as gods, and we might as well get good at it. And I think that I think that the sort of ideology is more explicitly optimistic insofar as perhaps they've faced the death of God and come out the other side. But I think that's something that really interests me, and increasingly interests me, both in SelfMade and some of my more recent work for the New Atlantis on this, which is sort of postdates this book, is the intersection of a new interest in spirituality, religion, and even magic, and sometimes the occult, in a lot of these very tech circles. I've written about the kind of post-rationalist turn within what was once the rationalist community. And I was recently, as we talked about when I was on your podcast, on a lecturing on a sort of disruptor tech cruise ship, where so many of the panels were like, there's a couple of like your standard, like your AI panel and your SpaceX panel, and it was all how to experience ego death, like psychedelics without psychedelics, somatic sexual healing, and so much of the kind of meat of the trip, so to speak, was this idea that personal optimization was like, perhaps you could call it spiritual wellness, that part of the, I'm trying to think about how to phrase this, simple technological advances were not enough on their own, that to be a kind of person who pursued optimization, you had to not only be an innovator in the, or whether it was founding a startup or using certain products or, you know, optimizing your life along certain axes, but also applying that to the spiritual field. And there was a sort of strange tension, I think, perhaps not fully resolved, between a belief in human potential to become our own gods on the one hand, and a constant sense that there was something more out there, some undiscovered truth that maybe if you just like did enough shrooms, you could in fact discover. But I think that these things are inextricable from one another. And I think it would be kind of overly simplistic to say like, well, there's a spiritual emptiness there and this is how they're filling it. I don't think that's not true, but I don't think that's the totality of the story. I think there's also a sense that whatever it means to be our own God, maybe we are not able to conceive of that outside of vision of the enchanted universe. And the enchanted universe, as I think most of us would understand it in 2023 in America, whether we're Silicon Valley tech people who are on this cruise or just sort of ordinary people caught up in the cultural miasma, is this language of vibes, of energy, of manifesting. I saw a study recently that over 50% of young Americans said, you know, they believe in manifesting to at least some degree. And I think that this sort of, a lot of us will talk about like positive energy or like good vibes in a sort of purely conversational way. I don't think all of us sit down and think we can really manifest our, you know, wealth. I don't know about you personally, Tamir.
Well, no, I mean, I was just going to say, ask the audience. When we did the podcast, I had no idea what manifesting is. Everyone here know what this stuff is? Yeah, you're all good? Oh, someone doesn't. Go ahead, explain.
So manifesting is the idea that you can basically bring things into reality by thinking about them. It's downstream of this 19th century self-help movement called New Thought, but it's incredibly popular on TikTok. And it is kind of part of this wider glut of popularity of self-help movements that are predicated on the notion that by looking within yourself, by harnessing your psychic power, by positive thinking, real things in the world will happen and change. It's sort of somewhere between positive thinking and magic. And indeed, I believe that those things are very closely intertwined in the history of magic, but that is another conversation. And I think that this is sort of so much part and parcel of contemporary American culture, especially for millennials, especially for Generation Z, that the language of harnessing energy, the language of looking within ourselves and our own psychological states to find the power to affect the universe in some way. It is a kind of, I won't say it rises to the level of a civil religion, but it is a shared set of metaphysical assumptions that underpin a lot of how, whether it's ordinary people or advertisers on the subway, frame and characterize our world.
Well, so we're in DC, so we should talk about politics a little bit, and we're in Politics and Prose, so even more so. Is it oversimplifying to say that there's something in the tendency to self-make that in politics yields stuff that's close to fascism? You've got, one of the key stories there is the aforementioned D'Annunzio, the sort of proto-fascist Italian leader, and the other figure is obviously Donald Trump himself. I don't know, play with that a little bit. Is there anything in everything you've described, and maybe even in this confluence of the aristocratic and the democratic and everything getting faster, what is it doing to our politics? And how, you said nothing good. Does it apply to this as well?
Yes. Or rather, the long answer is this. The fundamental end point of an ideal of self-making that holds that as human beings, what we ought to do is be our best selves. And to be our best selves is a process of manifesting, as it were, the person we see inwardly that we perceive ourselves to be outwardly, such that authenticity and artificiality converge in our expressed self. Now, the sort of end point of that ideal is that reality itself is what we make it. And I think that this is something that is sort of, you see throughout the story of self-making. I always like to say that every time there's an ideal of the self-maker, that is a innate and godlike. There's a parallel self-help handbook telling you how to fake it. And that is true in the Renaissance with the Book of the Courtier and the idea of sprezzatura or effortlessness. It is true in the branding, when everyone's got it in early Hollywood, and then there's this personal magnetism being proffered. But this idea that at some point it's not just fake it till you make it. It's that the idea, faking it is meaningless, because what it means to be a self-maker, what it means to be the sort of person who is actualized in the way that human beings ought to be, like the person who is best at doing the human thing, is the person who shapes a reality through perception, because reality is only perception. The idea of lying becomes meaningless, and I think that that's something where D'Annunzio certainly understood and embraced it. D'Annunzio, Italian decadent dandy poet who, through a very long and convoluted and very entertaining series of events, basically became a dictator in the Istrian Peninsula following World War I for 16 months or so. And he, in both his novelistic writings and his writings about his own political project, celebrates the kind of Nietzschean vision of the overman who makes himself God. Now, I'm not going to speculate whether Donald Trump thinks of himself as God, but he has publicly gone on the record about being influenced by Norman Vincent Peale, who was, of course, his family's personal pastor at Marble Collegiate Church, and one of the most famous kind of interlocutors for that movement I was talking about earlier, New Thought, the proto-manifesting. So New Thought is this 19th century movement. Basically, if you can imagine yourself getting healthier or richer, you will. And if you are poor or sick, it's just because you didn't want to be rich and healthy badly enough. That basically is taken up by Norman Vincent Peale in his enormously successful The Power of Positive Thinking, which is a kind of mid-20th century revival of New Thought. And so while I think it would probably be an overstatement to say like Donald Trump runs on New Thought, it is true that a lot of certainly his, the little we know about his intellectual lineage does come from this idea that the distinction between a lie and a truth is meaningless insofar as reality is downstream of desire. And I think that is something that in the world, the internet saturated world, is not just true of, with you want to call them strongmen or heads of cults of personality or people who perhaps traditionally have been very good at shaping perceptions in person or on television or before a crowd. But online, we are all in a world where reality is kind of downstream of what we make it, precisely because the physical limitations of reality don't exist online in the same way as they do offline. And so I think that what might have been true of historically interesting individuals is now all the more true of something that we all, like the landscape in which we all live.
I mean, maybe as a coda to that, it was almost an aside, but it was one of the more hopeful passages in the book, of sort of an assessment of Trump and Kardashian as already having been, consumed by all of us in the sort of fast internet age, and Kardashian's no longer, she's past her peak, her sort of social peak, and Trump maybe as well. Is that fair? You think that's right?
I think that's fair. I wanted to call the book From Albrecht Dürer to OnlyFans, but that wasn't assailable. So I do think that the Trump and Kardashian are sort of mark the end of the body of the book, and then there is an epilogue about Caroline Calloway, with whom I share a publication week, and sure, her memoir's out too, and OnlyFans culture. And I think it's strange now to think of, because Kim Kardashian is still such a byword for a certain kind of celebrity. I think that even in the time from 2020, when I first signed on to write this book, to 2023, she is now a kind of, perhaps whatever she started lives on long after her. In the era of TikTok, Instagram is passé. In the era of Instagram, reality television is passé. And so even the idea that someone got a reality show and became famous for being famous, having gone through a certain degree of gatekeeping, almost feels a bit ridiculous compared to someone who perhaps might come to fame by a single 10-second TikTok video that just happens to seemingly capture something quote-unquote authentic about themselves that seems to somehow interest us.
Well, so I have one more question for Tara. Please do get your questions ready and step up to the mic. I mean, we can keep talking, but I'm sure you have thoughts yourselves. Tara, then tell us a little bit then about what you were alluding to earlier, about the sense of alienation. I mean, there's a sense in the book that, again, like I said, I think at the beginning of it, you're quite even-keeled, and you say you don't want to engage in the kind of doomerism and the kind of writing that is saying this is all decline. And I think you go to like great ends to sort of point to ways in which these things have been liberating and has been, moving the ball forward. But at the very end, you do warn about the dangers of sort of celebrating self-actuation at the expense of other things. You alluded to it earlier, a sense of shared reality and community. Do you think, I mean, when you look at the book, the pendulum is swung from medieval times to the beginning in the Renaissance to this kind of thing, and that's a really long pendulum swing. Has the pendulum swung all the way now, and does it start swinging back to these kinds of things, a more communitarian, this kind of meaning? How do we recover that meaning after the pendulum has swung so broadly and for such a long time?
So I'm not sure. Which is to say, I wish that I had some kind of like easy policy prescription that would somehow get people to move towards a vision of the self and community. I will say I was a sort of COVID optimist in that regard, that time in isolation, longing for human connection would as well, like, lend itself to a post-pandemic shift that I don't necessarily think has happened. If anything, I think that perhaps all of that time many of us spent online has primed us to kind of be even more mentally online, or to think internetly than before. That said, I do think that there are various I think I'm a millennial. I'm 32. I think it's particularly among people a little younger than me, there is a more robust distaste for internet culture that, while I think, and this is again sort of more anecdotal, many younger people that I know, are all in and grew up on TikTok. A lot of people who grew up in it are all the more wary of it because it's been so much part of their lives and their peers' lives. And I do think too, and I think whatever one wants to make of like the phenomenon of social justice culture as a phenomenon, which is something I don't want to get into very much, except to say I think a really interesting element of it is that kind of one of the things it's predicated on is there are things about the parts of ourselves that we do not choose that affect us, and that being in certain kinds of solidarity and community and thinking of ourselves as moral beings in solidarity and community are things that contemporary liberal culture has not done enough of. And I think that whatever sort of direction that goes in ultimately, it does speak to the fact that there are people, particularly younger people, who are aware and interested in correcting for a kind of alienated culture.
Okay, so I am not a young person. I'm a much older person, a 20th century person. Two comments. One, is there a particularly American form of this, like the Great Gatsby? I mean, most of what you're talking about, I don't have a clue. But I do remember Gatsby and his self-creation. The other thing is, isn't there another stream of the human condition that people have always wanted to be part of something larger than themselves, which can be either good. I grew up right after World War II in what was still the New Deal, when Americans came together and we were trying to become more inclusive and include other people in what we were enjoying, or it can be the Nazi Party led by Hitler. People became part of something that was larger than themselves, and they nearly destroyed the world.
Absolutely. To sort of address both your comments briefly, I do think that the sort of Gatsby image of self-creation as being a kind of combination of creation of the self as a kind of character and the sort of self-made nature of acquiring wealth really converge. And so I think a figure like Gatsby is so culturally potent precisely because he speaks to both of those parts of self-making, the celebrity side and the economic side, and how these often more often than not do indeed go together. There's one of the sort of things I enjoyed most about writing my book was Thomas Edison, who is often remembered as this great innovator and an inventor, which he was. He was also really good at manipulating the press and a little bit of not quite a charlatan, but he massaged the truth until such time as various inventions were ready. So I think that this has a long-standing tradition in American life. To your second point, I do think that and I think sometimes it's sort of, it feels almost silly to talk about the human condition in generalities, as if it's not the sort of serious public intellectual work that we might do to speculate about it. But I do think I think we have to, and I think that one of the very weird things that makes us human is that we have an incredible capacity for creative freedom. We are also beings who kind of are vulnerable, both in the sense that we are animals who are sort of mortal in that way, and that we are social beings and relational beings. And navigating the difficulty of being all of these things at once is so central to the human condition. At the end of my book, I talk about Hamlet's, what a piece of work is a man soliloquy. This is not new. But I think that perhaps in this case, that many of us have, in a culture that celebrates the individual, a particular hunger for community, whatever that might look like. And I think you are right that the hunger for community may not necessarily lead us towards good community.
Thank you.
Hi, Tara. Hi, Demir. So I was struck by how you sort of dealt with this tension between authenticity, like the romantic idea of this like deep inward self that's can't change and is like this sacred gift from God, and then absolute self-creation out of nothing. But it also seemed like, and I like how you described the self-creation idea as being sort of building on the raw material of the sacred inner authentic self. But it also seems like at some points in this talk, and maybe also in the book, you talk about us just being totally self-created out of nothing. And do you think that those two ideas, like self-creation and authenticity together, and one building on the latter building on the former, or just total self-creation, like, do you think that's a historical development? Or is it?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. And then also, just which do you think is more true?
So I think that the way that self-creation is understood right now is a kind of mix of both of the models you described, which is that the ideal of authenticity, like I don't think authenticity is I personally do not think it's a very useful concept, or I think that it speaks to a variety of things imperfectly. I think that there's one way of talking about who we are that I think is very, very useful, and I think that a lot of the figures in this book, including figures like, great Oscar Wilde, people who celebrate creativity and human freedom, try to get at, which is there is something about who we are as individuals that is not reducible to a set of facts about our biography, a set of facts about where and how we were born, and that this is something that deserves dignity and that perhaps needs to be shared. And I think that part of what it means to be human is to share that. And I think these are all things that ought to be held up and preserved. And I think that there's no account of being human that does not hold that up, that is, to me, sustainable. Where I think that it kind of, the contemporary version of it, where I take issue with it, is a version that goes more like our internally felt sense of self, our desire and our desires specifically lead us to that authentic, true self, and that the most true way to be in the world is to reject social relationships or social obligations where those things perhaps come into conflict, or to see ourselves as fundamentally our desires kind of trying to escape custom and tradition. And this is something that you see, for example, like, this is not purely new. I think of a lot of the Enlightenment authors literally write about this. Like Montaigne, when he talks about his love of being naked, metaphorical and literal, a lot of what he's talking about is this idea that custom is imposed from without, like clothing. And isn't it a shame that we have to put something on us in order that will stop us from being our fullest selves? And I do not think, of course, and I think that, or rather, I want to draw the distinction between those two models precisely because I think one ought to be preserved. But a vision of authenticity as simply being who we feel ourselves to be, we are manifesting in our head the celebrity, the it girl, what have you, out there in the world, is a view that kind of presupposes that we have better access to our own desires and why we want what we want than we actually do. I don't think many of us know ourselves very well. I think it's the human condition to not know yourself very well. And so kind of a vision of that authentic self being predicated on the psychological risks assuming that we are perhaps more wise than we actually are.
Yeah, I think that I don't know if you like the term human nature, but I think that there's a distinction between it's not just our desires and what we make of those desires. You can get there in a lot of different ways, but there's our bodies, there's our history, there's a lot of substratum that, yeah.
I find great joy in the fact that being human is an extremely weird way to be, and that it is comprised of so many very different parts of existence.
Mm-hmm.
So
thank you.
Hi. Sorry, this mic is short. Thanks so much. I'm just wondering, this conversation so far has been in sort of a spiritual register for the most part, and I'm just curious if the role of technology and like sort of technique more generally shows up in the book at all, and how you think about the interface of spirituality and theology with technology, and if you have any key thinkers or books that sort of guide your thinking there.
Sure. Sorry, can you just clarify what you mean by the interface?
Yeah, like in this example, maybe the like, at least in my mind, of like how this is working, social media and technology, and the sort of whatever, like the conditions of mechanical reproduction or whatever are the kind of what allows all of this to happen in the first place. And so I'm just curious, how those interact.
Actually, I just reviewed a really wonderful book on this, which is Anton Barbacay's A Web of Our Own Making, and it is basically the best book that I have read recently, and it just came out, I want to say a couple of months ago, about this, where it's precisely about the way in which using what he calls the natural technologies, the sort of almost magical feeling smartphone technologies have changed how we interface with the world, with one another, and the kind of relationship between, what is desire like when we can fulfill certain desires instantaneously. And it's an incredible book. It's very detailed while also being like relatively short. So I can't recommend it highly enough.
Thank you.
Hi, Tara.
Hello.
As a Zoomer, I appreciate your intellectual attention to the vibes. And I guess I'm curious about how you see the interface of this desire to self-make and pursue authenticity and the ways that often plays out, especially on the internet, in the form of community, in the post-rat community, in communities around weird internet subcultures where people feel like they're all really being authentic in these very obscure corners of the internet, and how a desire for community also plays into the desire to self-make.
So I think one of the really interesting tensions about a world where we can connect virtually is that I think perhaps unprecedentedly we are able to form communities of affinity in a way that my people, the people that are my friends that I choose to be with, friendship's always been in part about kind of affinity and choice compared to, let's say, family. But the ability to kind of transcend geography or transcend our immediate circumstance to find like-minded people is something that the internet has made all the easier. And I largely think that's a good thing. As someone who I'd say at least 50% of my friends I met online, and am someone who is in many internet communities from which real life friendship has sprung. But I think that I worry that if this becomes the dominant mode of friendship in the way that it has become the dominant mode for example, romantic partnership, in terms of more and more people meeting online, the less we will be forced to become into contact with neighbors. And I think the category of the neighbor is a really, really important one for civic life, even if they're not friends exactly. Like people that you see every day, interact with, and have to, in some small way, coordinate with to make your community function, whether that's like making, you're the person who lives next to you, you break down the boxes in your recycling so that your neighbor doesn't have to do it if you're living in an apartment building. These small actions, they are kind of part of the stuff of life. And I'm wary of a social world that de-emphasizes the kind of relationships we could have with our neighbors on the grounds that they do not share certain affinities, be they aesthetic or political, with us.
Let me just push you on that one, though, Tara. Is there something else, though, that's missing in sort of online community? I mean, if you have a community that is solely based on the principles of self-actuation, because I think that comes out in your book a lot, that there's something not quite enough about that approach to human beings. So if you create a community around an approach that itself is not the whole thing, that's not enough. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. And I think I'd probably draw a distinction between people who meet online or even correspond online, but ultimately form offline friendships or offline social groups, and kind of fandoms where, and I think of fandom just because it's perhaps the most obvious example, where a lot of time is spent on the community thing, or sort of whether it's fan fiction or memes or posting, but where there's kind of less opportunity for the development of offline or in-person friendships out of it. And I think that I'm sort of the more real life stuff comes out of it and the more intimacy comes out of it, the more in favor of it I am.
Thank you. Thank you for this fascinating conversation. So I just wanted to mention, when you were talking about the conflation between technology and magic, the figure that comes to mind is Grimes. I feel like she really captures that most succinctly. But so I've got two questions. One is there a gender dynamic to how the selfie evolution has transpired from the 19th to the 20th to the 21st? Are you seeing more men than women participating in this earlier, and now it's more dominated by women, or is this like a gender-inclusive phenomenon? And then number two, I'm curious about, as you've traced these figures, do you discuss pushback? Forces that are disrupting the attempt at self-cultivation, or are we just entering a pretty frictionless era that because we have this device in our pocket, we can just constantly be involved in this project of self-invention at any given point in time?
Sure. So in terms of gender, sort of I don't know if you're asking sort of on a more recent selfie culture timescale, or on the sort of the timescale of the book, which is, I think, by the nature of the history involved, it is a self-making has largely been kind of, I won't say exclusively limited to, but about the narratives of self-makers have been narratives predicated around generally middle class or upper middle class white men. And that's in part because, more broadly, these narratives around self-making are also specifically tied into the burgeoning of certain kinds of like mercantile middle classes, both in the Renaissance, with the rise of figures of the artisan and the merchant in Regency England, for example, where the self-made middle class entrepreneur is sort of like the people around whom these narratives originally come out are often people who are not aristocrats, but increasingly have certain kinds of money and social mobility. So I see the kind of, to answer specifically on gender, it's really not, although there are like the odd female dandy, someone like Rothschild, it's really the old Hollywood and the cult of the celebrity that kind of provides women with an avenue towards self-making on a broader cultural level, rather than on the level of like individual people. And I think that this idea, so it is true that I was actually, I went back and forth on how I felt. I love the cover of the book, but I did think it's interesting that the Mona Lisa, it's a Mona Lisa on top and a sort of woman taking a selfie on the bottom, when the book is, for so much of its run time, page count, about men. And I think increasingly, though, insofar as celebrity culture and star culture have a certain erotic component to them, that has made like self-creation has become even more of a particularly a feminine or female-coded activity. Although I do think that is indeed changing again. I think anecdotally, more men are now posting what is often known as a thirst trap, perhaps. Like the idea of posting a picture of yourself looking really good for the delectation of the internet was something, I think, even 5 years ago that was explicit, like very, very female-coded, and now is less female-coded. And I'm so sorry, could you remind me your second question?
Friction to the project of self-invention.
So I think not as, I think my answer would be not as much as one would think. Or I think that individual critiques of individual movements existed without, like, one might critique dandyism on certain fronts, or there's critiques of the dandies of Regency England or of the late 19th century French decadence for being immoral in certain ways. There's accusations of sexual immorality around, let's say, the Warhol era factory girls, and sort of a lot of individual pushback is often against the figures as figures rather than against the idea of self-creation as a whole in a codified way. And perhaps now, I would say, as I've mentioned social justice as an example of something more programmatic now, which is, I think, rightly and fairly critical, and again, being a bit reductionist about a movement here, but like, I think one thing that we can see consistently is a critique of the idea of the individual self-creator. And actually, something I should have said earlier is that if there are critiques of certain kinds of individual freedom, one of the places that consistently they do come from, of course, is the Catholic Church and from religion more broadly. The accusation that there is something godless and perhaps dangerous in visions of humanity without God. But again, it's rooted in this being a kind of potentially godless or irreligious activity, rather than a critique that comes from outside of it.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Tara. I am so excited to see you because I've been loving reading your work for many years. I love Strange Rites. And the question that I had for you, I think, relates to both SelfMade and Strange Rites, which is, so I studied sociology of religion. And when I discovered Strange Rites, I was like, finally something that is taking the internet age seriously and bringing these into these conversations, and just kind of like, totally breaking open the paradigm for how to think about spirituality and where it's located. And so anyway, I've always really appreciated that. But I've also come away with the question, which is, not everyone is online, and people are online to varying degrees. And you have this incredible gift to like get into these really, really niche areas and compact areas of the internet and try to say figure out what they mean about society. But I've always wondered about the limits of that as well. What are we missing when we look like where everyone is wanting to look, who's interested in the online world, which is online? What are we missing when we're kind of, when we're not so much forgetting, but not talking actively about that tension between the online and the offline worlds? What kind of new sociological divisions are being developed around people who are shaped by internet ways of being and ways of talking and relating to each other, and people who aren't? Yeah.
That's a really good question. And I think that it's definitely fair to say that I think very little in my own work deals with people who are not, I will not say extremely online, but at least in part online. I do think more and more of us are. Almost 90% of Americans, perhaps that number has actually exceeded 90% now, have smartphones. I think that number is only going to increase. And I think, too, that the kind of like cultural miasma of online culture is not something that you can kind of insulate yourself from, even if you were someone who doesn't have a smartphone. I think about this, and of course, I grant that New York City is not exactly is perhaps a bit of, it's like saying, in Babylon, this is, you see it everywhere. But I always think like the subway advertisements that I see just like going through my day that 8 million New Yorkers see. Are so often like deeply rooted in either online culture or the kinds of like, I have seen far too many subway advertisements about like manifesting and positive energy, for example. And so, which is to say, I think that there probably is something to be gained from doing particular work on populations that are not as plugged in. But my prediction would be, especially in 5-10 years' time, barring the collapse of the internet, that this kind of cultural phenomenon is going to transcend its borders. And I think we've actually seen example whether it's to just give two examples of like mimetic cultures, certain such social justice language that began on Tumblr, let's say, on a very particular online community, has now become something that is quite sort of normal, mainstream language that could be found. And Gamergate, for example, has become quite mainstream. And that's not to sort of say anything about any of those movements, except that things that start among the extremely online do not remain always on the extremely online.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have time for one?
We have time one more.
Yes, V for victory. Hey, Tara. So my question is about the extent to which self-making and self-expression is even possible. There's a great Chuck Klosterman essay with Taylor Swift, where he's talking to Taylor Swift, and she's basically like, the thing people don't understand about me is that the only thing I care about in the universe is being the world's biggest pop star, and I'm monomaniacally obsessed with that, and that's deeply unrelatable. So I have to talk about all this bullshit that I don't care about so that people care about me. Separately, Spencer Greenberg, the social researcher, has done a lot of research on what happens when you ask people to tell you about themselves. And what's interesting is they almost never say like, oh, I have a mole on my neck. It's always like, I live in this place, which a million other people live in. I like this movie, which millions of other people like. I love this sports team, which millions of... They basically describe themselves in almost the least individual ways possible when you ask people to tell you about themselves. So I'm curious to what extent in your research is this sort of obsession with self-expression actually about the self at all versus how the self wants to be perceived by others, either instrumentally or because of the intrinsic value of the relationship?
So I don't see a distinction. For me, self-making is precisely the act of front-loading in communication those things we want other people to see. It doesn't surprise me at all that someone doesn't mention a mole, for example, on their neck, something that they perhaps did not choose and do not feel defines them. And so I feel like the story of telling one's own story of oneself is a story of basically you talk about what you want, what you love, what you think defines you. And I think to a lesser extent, but still true, you might talk about things that define you that you did not choose, where you are from or where you grew up or elements of your background. And I think that how we understand the act of talking about ourselves is precisely like self-making is not for, I don't know, some purpose that is not wedded to how we are perceived by others. We're not like making ourselves in order to like hole ourselves up in a library for the rest of our lives. I mean, Montaigne did indeed hold himself up in a library, but then he wrote a lot of essays addressed to the reader about himself. I cannot think of a more robust self-creator than Montaigne, which is to say self-creation is a social act, precisely. And I think that the managing of the perceptions of others, be it through an idealistic set, like I think that is what some of our more cynical self-makers, from Machiavelli to P.T. Barnum, get, which is that self-making is about managing perception.
Thank you.
Tara, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone in the audience. Please stick around, buy Tara's books. She'll be signing them up here. Yeah?
Yep.
So, great. Tara, thanks.
Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you all so much. Once again, books can be sold for